Hello, friends. It is time to talk about my most disappointing reads of the year, and I have 10 of them to talk about. Now, these are not necessarily my worst books of the year. I probably did have a few that were worse than this. Actually, I definitely did. Although some of my worst books of the year are definitely on this list. But there are some books that I gave like 3 stars. But these are the most disappointed books, because I had the highest expectations for these books based off various reasons, and they just didn't live up to what I wanted them to live up to. Now, if you loved any of these books, I'm so glad that you enjoyed them. Reading is very subjective, and there is obviously some give and take in reading, and some people like books people didn't like, and vice versa. And that is completely okay. We can agree to disagree on these books and still have fun and still be book friends. I am going to kind of count these down, but basically they are all my biggest disappointments of the year for various reasons. So let's just jump in to number 10. In our 10th spot, we have Bonded by Thorns by Elizabeth Helen. And this is a good example of this being a disappointing read versus a worst read. I still gave this 3 stars. The second half of this book really bought me in. I think I would not be continuing with this series if it wasn't for the second half of the book. The second half of the book really got me interested into what is to come with this series. But the first half just did not work for me. The first half really was too much like the Disney version of the Beauty and the Beast story. It was so much like it. And I do love a retelling, but I need my retellings to be a little bit different from the original. And this was basically giving me the original, but making the Beast 4 guys. There was even moments where the dialogue was exactly the same, and it just did not work for me, and I was really quite bored through the first part of this book. Now, in the later half, it did deviate away from that, and that's where it got my attention. So I'm interested to see how I feel about book 2. I do think I'm going to give book 2 a try, see how I feel about it, and then kind of decide on the series. But considering I rarely dislike a Beauty and the Beast retelling, I mean, normally a Beauty and the Beast retelling is going to at least get 4 stars. Something has to be very wrong for a Beauty and the Beast retelling to not get 4 stars for me. This getting a 3 really did make it disappointing to me. I've had it on my shelf for a while. I've really wanted to read this series, and I know so many people love this series, so I was kind of hyped for it as well. We'll see how book 2 goes, but yeah, this one did not hit the way I wanted it to. In our 9th spot, we actually have the same author that is in my 9th spot of my best books of the year. So I think you could see why that would be disappointing, because if an author is on my best books of the year, obviously I'm going into another book by that author with very high expectations. And again, this one just did not hit the same, and that was One for My Enemy by Olivia Blake. It started off so good. The first half of this book, I was like, this is exactly what I wanted from a Romeo and Juliet retelling, a magical one. We had kind of like a mafia style vibe between the Antonoff sisters and the Fedorov brothers. And we had like 2 love stories within that, one from the past, one from the present. And we had like these love stories that could not work, and this magic system that I was interested in, and everything was going so well. And then the middle went off the rails, and we lost sight of what we were trying to do. And it all just kind of became a bit discombobulated. And we lost sight of, I think, what couple and what we really wanted to have happen. And there was a lot of like, this is happening. No, wait, this is happening. No, wait, this is happening. No, wait, this is happening. And I always hate that. And it just really lost my interest in the second half of the book, which really is quite sad, because the first half of this book was just as good as I was expecting from an Olivia Blake. I read 3 Olivia Blakes this year, and 2 of them I really liked, and this one just did not hit. I will continue to read Olivia Blake. I've had more successes than disappointments, but this one just did not work as well as I wanted it to. Because I did like the first part of this book, I did give it a 3 star, but it could have been a 5 had the second half been even slightly as good as the first half. This was like a middle of the book disappointment. Like, it became disappointing as we went along. For our number 8th book, we have Here We Go Again by Alison Cochrane. This is a disappointing read, again, that I did give 3 stars. It was not a worst book of the year. It was just very disappointing, because I've given the previous 2 books by this author 5 stars. So I went into this with a very 5-star prediction vibe. Kiss Her Once for Me was on my best books of the year in the year that I read it. The Charm Offensive probably could have been, had I not had like 10 other great books that year. Like, I love the books by Alison Cochrane. The romance in this was really the thing that let me down. The romance in this book between our two main characters just did not work because I don't think the author really was trying to write a romance, but it almost felt like they had to because they've written romances in the past. In this book, we follow Logan and Rosemary. They are both teachers at the school that they grew up in, and their retired teacher, Joe, who helped raise them and was like their favorite teacher growing up, and they've kind of found a found family with Joe, is diagnosed with cancer and he is dying. And they did have like a friendship that kind of had a romance in it, but not really in the past. And they really haven't spoken since this friendship kind of blew up. They could just kind of coexist. But they come together to answer Joe's last wish of going on this road trip across the country. And this part of the book was fabulous. And I think had this book been that, these students coming together to help Joe finish out his last days, this book would have been perfect. Because that part of the book was perfect. But the relationship felt so forced inside the book, and it just was distracting from what I think was the major points of the book, which was this grieving, this found family, this great representation in this book of Joe's cancer and how you kind of want to live out your last days and what it's like to have someone you love living out their last days and what that's like for you to process. All of that was so good. And I think had that been the book and not this romance, which ended up being like the main plot, but really should have been the B plot or not even in there, honestly, was distracting from this really beautiful story that was Joe's and the girls and Joe with the girls. This was also a road trip book, which I will say is not necessarily a favorite of mine. I think anytime that characters are stuck in a very small place for most of the book, and most of the plot happens in one location, like a boat or a road trip in a car, I get lost. Like, I just want more description of locations. I want more things happening, not just them driving in a car and really nothing happening in the car. It just kind of takes away from the story for me when that happens, boat, car books, all that. So that was also a detractor for this. That is definitely more of a personal preference thing than a book problem. But overall, when I go into a 5-star prediction book and end up with a 3, it is highly disappointing. Now, this next author did end up on my best books of the year last year, almost at the very, very tippy top. Actually, 2 books of theirs ended up in my best books of the year last year. So that is why this was one of my most anticipated releases of this year. And again, we ended up at a 3-star. But this was a 3-star of this book. It exists and I read it, which is like the worst type of 3-star. And that is The Familiar by Leigh Bardugo. I love Ninth House and Hellbent. And it's really interesting because the part of Ninth House and Hellbent that I love the most is this like magic system that's going on in these magical societies and these magical sororities at Yale. And the magic in this was such a letdown. The writing style was still distinctly Leigh Bardugo. So I liked the writing style. And there were sentences in here that instantly would like catch my attention and be like, yes, this is Leigh Bardugo. But the magic was such a secondary plot to this book, and it is historical fantasy, so I guess that makes sense, and maybe partially the problem was that this is just not my genre, but I went into it loving Ninth House and Hellbent so much that I was expecting to still love this because of the writing style and the magic. But the magic was so secondary to the history of the Spanish Inquisition, and maybe if you were really into the Spanish Inquisition or into history, you might like this book more than I did. Like, that's fair. Every reader is subjective, and what you find interesting in a book is subjective. To me, I did not care. And there were so many characters in here that blended together, and I was like, who are we talking about? Who is this person? Who's that person? What are they? Why are they here? Who cares? And truly, if you were to say, tell me the plot of The Familiar, I don't think I could, and I only read it 6 months ago. Yes, I tend to forget character names, but I don't tend to forget whole books in 6 months. Like, that is how little I cared about this book. And I did read it during the Amazing Readathon, so like there is a possibility that that also impacted this a little bit, but I don't think so. I don't think reading it fast was the reason I didn't like it, because I liked a lot of books that I read during Amazing Readathon. This was just not what I wanted from a Leigh Bardugo book. And I did go in with very high expectations, but the fact that this book is just so mid that I remember nothing makes me so sad. Now for this next spot, we are going to talk about a whole series. Now I've unhauled this series, so I don't have it to hold up, but it's the Chestnut Spring series. I really thought I was going to love this. I really did, because the amount of hype on this series is just out of this world. Like, the hype level of this series is woo. And honestly, people talk about multiple books in the series. They talk about the first book with like love and affection. They talk about the second book, Daddy Cade, which like I did give the second book 5 stars, but we're going to talk about that because I somewhat want to retract that 5 star at this point. That was the only one I liked, though. When I read it, I did give it 5 stars. But then I read Powerless. And the way Cade acts in the start of Powerless made me dislike Cade and Willa. And that makes me so sad. Because I feel like Powerless ruined Heartless for me. And that really makes me sad because it was the only one I liked. I read Flawless. I loved Heartless. I DNF'd Powerless halfway through. And that made me dislike Heartless. I read Reckless. And I did not even try with Hopeless. By Hopeless, I was like, no, I can't do it. And I do think that it is a cowboy romance thing as well as a writing thing with Elsie Silver. Like, there's just so much in these books that I did not like. And I have since read other cowboy romances and not liked those either. So, like, it could be just that cowboy romances are not for me. But, like, these men, I just didn't like them. I'm sorry, friends. I didn't like them. And also, the pseudo-incest thing of Powerless just, like, did not work for me. And I think it isn't incest. They're not really related. But because it's constantly brought up in the book, it made it part of the plot. Because they like grew up raised as cousins. And everybody in the book is like, oh, they're cousins. Like if they were just like grew up as he was a friend of the family, but very close to the family and she was their cousin. Like I was fine with that. Like that in and of itself, fine, totally fine. But the amount of times it's brought up in Powerless and it becomes like a plot point to Powerless, like I just couldn't. I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it, friends. I couldn't do it. The amount of times I use the word cousin smut in conversations with Leandra, those words should not come out of my mouth. I know this is such a well-loved series, and I know I have talked about it a lot on this channel, even when I DNF'd the series earlier a couple months ago when I put out like 15 series I'm not bringing into the year. But so many people talk about these books and love them, so I just had such high expectations. So it was such a disappointment to me when I didn't love them. Hopefully in 2025, we are onward and upward to better romance books. Now, the next 3 books on this list are DNFs, but I did read a significant portion of each of them, so I felt like it was okay to mention them in this, because some of them I DNF'd at 50%, some of them I DNF'd with like 80 pages left in the book. So I read most of the book. And the first one of those is An Education in Malice by S.T. Gibson. This broke my heart because, first of all, I loved A Dowry of Blood. I love A Dowry of Blood. I love dark academia. This is a dark academia by the person who wrote A Dowry of Blood. I should have loved this. I should have absolutely loved it. It's also a retelling of the story of Carmilla. Like, I should have loved this. But I ended up DNFing it about 50%, and I don't remember the exact percentage. I do have a vlog of this during August when I read it. This was such a disappointment to me because truly I thought I was going to love this. I had the arc of this book. Like I thought I was going to love this. There is no reason on paper that I should have disliked this, except that the vibes were just not there. The vibes were not there in this book. The dark academia vibes were so lacking, and the writing was still great because it's S.T. Gibson and the writing's great, but it wasn't enough for me to care about these characters. And we would have huge time jumps in the story where like months would pass at this school with very little knowledge of what happened during that time. And it was a bit of tell not show, and I didn't love it. And I didn't care about these characters. And again, the dark academia vibes weren't enough to hold me on. It really didn't feel like a dark academia book, even though it totally was. It takes place in a school. But it just didn't have the vibes I needed to catch my attention, and I felt like I was so bored. And considering, again, I loved Dowry of Blood, I was never bored in that book, never once. To have the feeling of boredom during this book just like made me so sad. And I had to put it down because it was like making me actually sad to not love this book. This next one, I just DNF'd right before the end of the year. I DNF'd it on like December 29th, December 30th. Like it was very late in the year when I DNF'd this book. And it was a much anticipated release for me. So that's how it ended up on this list. And that is Apples Dipped in Gold by Scarlett St. Clair. Way back in March or April, I don't remember the exact month, Rainey and I read Mountains Made of Glass, and we binged that book in like an afternoon. We read it so fast. That's a Beauty and the Beast, Rumpelstiltskin combo retelling, and it was such a good book. I gave it 4.5 stars. It was almost perfection. So I was highly anticipating this book. This is a Sleeping Beauty, Snow White combo. It was a fairy tale retelling. It was a series continuation that I loved the first book of. Like, I had very high expectations. And immediately upon reading this, I was like, something's not the same. Something is not the same. I could not remember the characters. If you asked me anything about this book now, I would not remember. I read it 2 weeks ago. Like, even from the point that I would put the book down and the next day I was supposed to pick it up for the buddy read, and I would remember nothing from the day before. Nothing. I had nothing to make me want to pick it back up. It just was not capturing my attention. The characters didn't capture my attention. The retelling wasn't enough to really make it have the right vibe. And honestly, I knew it was a Sleeping Beauty retelling because I was told. And I knew it was a Snow White retelling because I was told. But it didn't really feel like either of those. Maybe we were trying to combine two stories and the two stories didn't combine well, so then it just made it feel like neither. That might be the problem. I don't know. It just wasn't good. And honestly, I don't think I'm going to continue with this series. So I think this series is another one that I'm going to end up DNFing the whole series. I think I'm going to leave Mountains Made of Glass as a standalone that I really did enjoy and just let the rest of the series come out and not really pay too much attention to it. The last book on this list that I DNF'd at 80 pages left in the book. And you have to know that I have to really dislike a book to not push through and finish it for the last 80 pages. I read this with Bree for Accidental Book Club, and it is The Au Pair Affair by Tessa Bailey. Tessa Bailey's sequels lately have just not worked for me. Last year, Secretly Yours and Unfortunately Yours. Secretly Yours was almost a 5-star for me. I gave it a 4.5. I adored it. Unfortunately Yours, I gave it 2. And that one was Marriage of Convenience, which is a trope that I love. This year, we had Fangirl Down. I gave it 4 stars. I really liked Fangirl Down. I had a really good time with it. The sequel, The Au Pair Affair, a DNF with 80 pages left. I should not have DNF'd a book with 80 pages left, but I hated this couple so very much. And this was a hockey romance. I should have loved a hockey romance. It was a hockey romance with a single dad and a nanny. And I loved the two characters when we met them in the first book for Fangirl Down. I was so excited to read their book. And unfortunately, it just did not work. The way he treated her and the way he just was like not understanding how to communicate with his child or with her or with anybody. He was not a good communicator. I was hearing things in the book club of how the ending was going to happen and what was going to happen in the end. And really, I just could not be fussed to finish. Vanessa told me the ending of the book because I was like, well, just someone spoil it for me. Like, I don't need to spend the next 2 hours trying to finish this book. Like, let's just finish it. And truly, this has been a common problem, like I said, with Tessa Bailey, is that the sequels are just not working. And honestly, I don't know what the problem is. I don't know if we're trying to do too much in a year, because even the one of her Under the Mistletoe stories, I really didn't like that either this year. It was the worst one in the collection for me. I gave it 2 stars. So there's something going on with her later releases in the year. The first one seems to be the best one, and then the ones after it are just kind of downhill each one. And I'm wondering if that's an writing issue. Are we trying to publish too many books in a year? I think maybe. I think that might be the problem. Are we trying to be a little bit more risque with our smutty scenes and therefore they're coming off cringy? Maybe. I don't really know. But something's not quite right. This series is another one that I've decided to DNF because the next book in the series is a pseudo incest relationship as well with 2 step siblings. And as we talked about with Chestnut Springs, that is something that I just don't want to deal with. It's just not something that I like to read. If you like to read it, that's great. Everybody, I don't care if you do, but it just doesn't work for me. We are on to our second to last book in this list, and it is Kiss the Girl by Zordea Cordova. I love the Meant to Be series with my whole heart. It is a retelling series, contemporary romances, each written by different authors, and I think that may have been what the biggest problem was with this book, is that this author took a really different way with the story and did not really have nearly as many Easter eggs to the original story as the other 2 books in the series did. And it made it not really feel like a Little Mermaid retelling. And since we're going into these books really expecting that after Buy the Book and If the Shoe Fits, this just didn't give the Little Mermaid. I mean, yes, the characters had the same names. In this one, we obviously follow Ariel and Eric. Ariel is part of a large, very popular band with her 7 sisters, and their dad is like their dadager, and he is very controlling, and she is wanting a break, and she actually runs away to be a groupie for Eric's band and like help sell t-shirts at the table, like in disguise. And they fall in love, and eventually her overbearing father comes to take her back. Which, I mean, doesn't even really fit with, like, King Triton's actual, like, person. I mean, yes, he was controlling, but there were reasons why he was controlling. It just didn't fit. Like, Ursula is the villain, not King Triton. But in this, we went with King Triton being the villain. And I guess that makes sense, but, like, it just didn't fit. It just didn't fit. It didn't work for me. The vibes were off. But I will be continuing with this series, and actually the next book in the series is on my January TBR and is my Patreon buddy read. So, like, I will be reading the next one and hoping that that one has more of the fairy tale vibes that I've come to expect from the series. So the last book we're going to talk about, I also read really, really recently, and it is my only 1-star of the year, and that was Make the Season Right by Ashley Herring Blake. I have loved Ashley Herring Blake books in the past. Astrid Parker, 5 stars. Delilah Green, 4 stars, a very high, almost 5-star book. This was such a toxic relationship. They should not have gone back together. And with a second chance relationship, you need to make me believe that they should be back together, that they've grown, that they've changed, that all the things that made them not work the first time are not going to be a problem the second time. And I truly believe that, especially in the epilogue, I was watching history repeat itself. Brighton leaves Charlotte at the altar 5 years ago with no explanation, none at all. Just leaves her and doesn't talk to her for 5 years. They end up meeting up at a friend's house over Christmas, and they end up falling back in love. But, like, it's so toxic. It's so, so toxic. And they keep trying to make me feel like Charlotte is the villain, and Charlotte is not the villain. Charlotte was left at the altar. Her heart was broken, and her fiance treated her like dirt. Why am I thinking she's the villain? Like, why book are you trying to tell me she's the villain? She's not the villain. Brighton is the villain of this story, and a romance doesn't need a villain out of the couples. Like, if I'm trying to root for a couple in a romance, neither of them should be a villain, frankly. Like, how am I supposed to root for a couple where there is a villain in their story that is one of them because they treated the other one so poorly? And they're not apologizing for that in the new timeline. Like, I guess she kind of does. But again, she keeps trying to make it seem like Charlotte was the one who did the wrong things, instead of saying, I'm sorry, I treated you like crap. I was having second thoughts, and instead of handling that properly, because yes, I was young, and yes, I made some choices and I made some mistakes, I have learned from them. She never says that. I don't know what happened with this book. I'm just going to forget it ever existed, and I'm going to continue to read Ashley Herring Blake like this book never existed. But those are my 10 most disappointing reads of the year, and now that I've discussed them for one last time, I am going to forget that they even exist, cleanse them from my soul, move on. Some of these authors I will try again, some of them I won't. It will depend on who they are, and we'll see if maybe their next releases, if they are authors that I'm going to try again, will not be on the most disappointing reads of next year. Fingers crossed. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.